It was a rainy Tuesday morning in Manhattan, the kind that painted the skyline gray and muted the city's usual roar. Inside a corner office at Trump Tower, the former president sat behind a heavy mahogany desk, sifting through stacks of neatly arranged documents and correspondence. His schedule, as always, was packed. Meetings, interviews, policy briefs, yet something small, barely the size of a postcard, sat alone on top of the stack. A handwritten envelope with slightly smudged ink. It had no return address, just a name, from a forgotten farmer. That phrase alone was enough to halt his routine. He picked it up slowly, eyeing the trembling loops of the handwriting. The paper was creased, its edges frayed, carrying the scent of earth and old wood. He opened it. "Mr. Trump, I don't expect you to read this. Heck, I'm not even sure it'll get to you. But if you are reading, I hope you understand this comes from a man who's lost everything." The letter was from a farmer in Iowa, 67 years old, third generation. Droughts, soaring fertilizer prices, supply chain failures, and a bank that had finally said, no more. He had lost his land last week. Land his grandfather had cleared by hand. The land his father once plowed with pride. Now gone. Repossessed. Sold to a corporate investor who would likely never set foot on it. I ain't asking for money or pity. I just want someone to know that it all disappeared. Quietly. No camera. No story. Just gone. Trump sat back, the letter resting gently in his hands. The room suddenly too quiet. The city noise below faded. In that moment, the life of a man he'd never met weighed more than any headline. And then he stood up. Slowly. Deliberately. The room's energy shifted. Because what was once just a letter was about to become something much more. Trump paced slowly across his office, the letter still gripped tightly in his hand. His staff waited outside, unaware that the rest of the day's schedule was about to be upended. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about polls, speeches, or media narratives. He was thinking about dirt under fingernails, about calloused hands, about a man whose entire world had been swallowed, not with a bang but with silence. He sat down again, opened the letter a second time, and read it word for word. Slower now, digesting each sentence like it was more than just ink. The farmer had included details, his wife's name Marianne, his two sons who moved to cities because there was nothing left to inherit, and one last line that made Trump's throat tighten. "When we lost the land, Marianne cried for the first time in 20 years. I didn't even cry at my daddy's funeral, but I cried then. This wasn't politics. This wasn't spin. This was America. Raw and real." His chief of staff knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Trump, you're due for the Fox interview in 20 minutes. Trump didn't answer right away. He folded the letter carefully and slid it into his inner coat pocket. Then he turned. "Cancel it," he said flatly. There was a pause. "Sir?" "I said cancel it. Call the team. Get me a flight to Iowa." The aide blinked. "Iowa?" Trump stood, straightened his tie, and grabbed his coat. "You want a headline?" he said as he walked past. "I'll give you one. But I'm not doing it from behind a desk. This wasn't for press. This wasn't even for the cameras, at least not yet. This was something he hadn't done in a long time. He was going to look a forgotten American in the eye and say, "You're not forgotten anymore." And that was only the beginning. The jet sliced through the skies, bound for Des Moines. No media alert, no red carpet. Just a former president, a tight-knit team, and a mission that didn't quite fit into any usual playbook. Trump sat quietly by the window, staring into the clouds. The letter still folded neatly in his jacket pocket, like a compass guiding this unexpected detour. He hadn't told anyone, yet not even his staff, the real reason he was going. But in his mind, he could already see it. The farmhouse, the empty fields, maybe an old tractor rusting out by the barn. He'd met thousands of people on the campaign trail, heard a million stories, but this one wouldn't let go. There was something in the way it was written. No anger, no demand, just quiet grief. A whisper in a world screaming for attention. When the plane landed, there were no flashing cameras or waiting crowds. A single black SUV waited on the tarmac. Trump stepped in without a word. "Take me to this address," he said, handing the driver a slip of paper. "And don't tell a soul." 2 hours of winding country roads later, the SUV slowed to a stop. Outside the window, miles of empty fields, the kind that looked more like memory than landscape. And in the middle of it all, a small, weathered farmhouse with white paint peeling off the edges. A crooked mailbox leaning toward the road like it had seen too many winters. Trump stepped out. It was quiet, eerily so. Just wind and distant birds. He walked up the gravel path slowly, almost reverently. The porch creaked under his feet. A dog barked somewhere behind the house. Then the screen door opened. An older man stood in the doorway. Flannel shirt, denim jeans faded by years of work. His face was lined, not just with age, but with everything that had been lost. And yet, behind those eyes, recognition. "Mr. Trump?" Trump nodded once. "You wrote me a letter." The man swallowed hard. "I never thought you'd actually read it." Trump reached into his coat and pulled out the folded paper, holding it up gently between two fingers. "I didn't just read it," he said. "I haven't stopped thinking about it." There was silence. Then the farmer stepped back, holding the door open with a shaking hand. "You'd better come in then." And as the door closed behind them, neither of them knew yet that this visit would ignite something much bigger than just a quiet farm. The farmhouse was small, humble, clearly lived in, worn by decades of use. Family photos lined the hallway, many of them fading under glass. Young boys in overalls, a woman with soft eyes and a quiet smile, a proud father holding up a harvest pumpkin the size of a small car. The home smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee, the kind of scent that lingers through generations. Trump stepped inside slowly, respectfully, like he was walking into a sacred space. The farmer's name was Henry McCall, offered a seat at the kitchen table. He poured coffee from a weathered pot and placed the cup down with a tremble in his hand. "It's not much," he said, "but it's what's left." Trump didn't touch the cup. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, letters still between them. "Henry," he said carefully, "you wrote about your family, about what this land meant to you. I've been in boardrooms with billionaires who don't speak with half the honesty you put in that letter." Henry looked down. "It wasn't supposed to be for anyone but me. I wrote it because I didn't know what else to do. Marianne," his voice caught, "she passed last month, right after the auction." Trump's expression softened. "I'm sorry." She didn't say much toward the end. But when the last piece of the land was sold off, she said, "It's like we never existed." That broke me. The room fell quiet. A clock ticked somewhere in the background. Outside, the wind pushed softly through bare trees. "I didn't write to complain," Henry continued, his voice quieter now. "I wrote because I didn't know if anyone saw us. You know what it's like to wake up every morning and wonder why you're still here?" Trump nodded slowly. "More than you think?" Henry looked up, finally meeting his eyes. "So why are you really here?" Trump took a deep breath. "Because I've built towers, made deals, run for the highest office in the world. But none of that means a damn thing if I can't look a man like you in the eye and say, 'You're not invisible.'" Henry blinked back tears. His hands, worn and cracked from decades of labor, gripped the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "But there's nothing left to save," he said. Trump stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out across the vast, empty fields. "Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But he told me something in this letter that Washington forgot a long time ago." He turned back toward the old man. "America doesn't live in D.C., it lives here." Henry didn't answer. He didn't need to. The rune carried the weight of two men from different worlds, bound for a moment by shared understanding. And though no cameras flashed, no headlines ran that evening, something undeniable had shifted. Because when Trump walked out of that farmhouse, he wasn't just carrying a letter anymore. He was carrying a cause. And this time, he wasn't walking alone. That night, back in the modest hotel outside Des Moines, Trump sat alone with a yellow notepad on his lap, and the farmhouse still etched in his mind. The usual entourage was absent. No aides, no advisors. Just silence, the ticking of a wall clock, and the image of Henry's tired eyes. He didn't just see a man who had lost his land. He saw a reflection of something deeper. A forgotten America. He scribbled phrases furiously. Land ownership, dignity, American backbone, rebuilding trust. His pen paused often, but not from hesitation, from calculation. Every word mattered now. This wasn't just another campaign speech. It was something more. The next morning, unannounced and unfiltered, Trump posted a video. No dramatic music, no studio polish. Just him, standing in front of a sun-drenched Iowa cornfield. Hair slightly windswept, expression unusually grounded. "This isn't about politics," he said. "This is about a man who lost everything and still had the strength to write a letter not asking for help, but just to be heard." And I heard him. The video exploded. Within hours, #letter to Trump trended across social media. People from all across the country, farmers, small business owners, veterans, single moms, began sharing their own stories. Letters poured in by the thousands. Fox News aired the video in full. Even CNN, reluctant at first, couldn't ignore the sudden cultural wave. This wasn't a political stunt, it had the fingerprints of something real. Behind the scenes, Trump began assembling a team not of political strategists, but of economic advisors, nonprofit leaders, agricultural reform experts. The plan? A nationwide relief initiative, the American Roots Project. Its first mission, to reclaim, rebuild, and restore small farms lost to bankruptcy and disaster. But this time, it wouldn't be top-down government aid. It would be direct, local, personal, and it would start with Henry McCall. Trump called him personally that week. "I want your farm back in your name," he said. "And I'm going to make sure it happens." Henry couldn't speak. He just cried. What began as a single letter had ignited a firestorm. One that couldn't be spun, silenced, or sold. Because it wasn't about Trump. It wasn't even about Henry. It was about the soul of a nation that had been aching to be seen again. And now, finally, it was. The media reaction was instantaneous and polarized. On conservative platforms, Trump was hailed as a hero, a leader reconnecting with the forgotten soul of America. "Trump returns to his roots," blared one headline. "A farmer's letter just changed the conversation," wrote another. But in the legacy media, skepticism brewed. "Publicity stunt?" asked MSNBC's morning panel. "Is this real concern or calculated optics?" They debated on CNN. Trump didn't respond, not with a tweet, not with a press conference. He let the story breathe. And the public made up its mind without spin. Comments flooded in. "My grandfather lost his land in the 80s. Watching this made me cry. I've never supported Trump, but this hit something real. Finally, someone listens." Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the American Roots Project was gaining traction. It wasn't just an idea anymore. Lawyers were reviewing land auction contracts. Donors were stepping forward. Agricultural nonprofits were signing on to collaborate. And perhaps most remarkably, Trump wasn't the face of it. He was the engine behind it. Quietly funding, quietly coordinating, letting the movement speak for itself. Then came a twist nobody saw coming. The bank that had repossessed Henry McCall's land released a statement. "After internal review and with the support of private donors, we are working with the McCall family to return ownership of their property under special provision. The public reaction? Explosive. News anchors scrambled. Talk show hosts debated ethics and power. But rural America? It just celebrated. In towns like Greeley, Iowa, and Shelbyville, Tennessee, people watched the story unfold and saw something rare. A powerful man keeping a promise. And Henry? He was back on his land. Photos surfaced online. Henry walking the old dirt path with his grandson. A red tractor being tuned up in the barn. And in the center of the field, a new wooden sign hammered into the earth. Still standing. Still farming. Trump never posted the photo, but he saw it, printed it, framed it, and placed it on the wall of his Florida office. Because for all the headlines, all the noise, and all the politics, what mattered most was this. One man was no longer invisible, and an entire country had just remembered where it came from. As Henry McCall's story settled into the American consciousness, something unexpected began to happen. Across the Midwest Ohio, Indiana, Nebraska, Missouri rural communities stirred. Small farms that had quietly struggled for years were now stepping into the spotlight. Local papers that once only covered county fairs now ran front-page features with headlines like, "Could the McCall miracle happen here?" Trump's farm revival inspires hope in Grain Belt. Calls started flooding into the newly formed American Roots Project offices, farmers with similar stories. Landowners at risk of losing everything. Veterans who had returned home only to see their family land swallowed by debt. The letters came too, handwritten and raw. Some were just a few lines scribbled on lined notebook paper. We thought no one gave a damn about us anymore. Maybe we were wrong. I lost my land in '09. My son never forgave me. Maybe now we have a shot. Trump read dozens personally. Staffers noticed he would go quiet after reading each one, sometimes staring out the window for minutes before turning back to his paperwork. He wasn't emotional, not visibly, but he was invested. The next move was bolder. Trump announced a nationwide town hall tour, not the flashy rallies of the past, but intimate gatherings at high school gyms, old barns, and county fairgrounds. The media rolled its eyes at first. A glorified book tour, one pundit sneered. He's trying to rebrand, another claimed. But they missed the point. Trump wasn't talking about the election. He was talking about topsoil erosion, seed monopolies, bank corruption, things the political class barely mentioned. And the people? They came in droves. Not with signs and chants, but with tears and stories. In Springfield, Missouri, a fifth-generation farmer named Lyle stood up and said, "I voted Democrat my whole life. But sir, I've never felt like anyone heard me until now." That moment went viral. It wasn't campaign politics. It was deeper. It was about being seen. As the tour gained momentum, the media couldn't ignore it anymore. And suddenly, the narrative began to shift. This wasn't a stunt. It was a movement. What started with one letter had become a national conversation. And Trump? He wasn't looking for applause. He was looking for redemption, not for himself, but for a forgotten America he had once promised to remember. The final stop of the town hall tour was planned for Des Moines, Iowa, a symbolic heart of American agriculture. The gymnasium wasn't fancy. Just folding chairs, an old wooden podium, and a patchwork crowd of locals. Farmers in denim, veterans in faded ball caps, teenagers with curious eyes, and elders who remembered tougher times. As Trump walked onto the small stage, there was no grand entrance, no dramatic music, no teleprompter. Just a stack of letters in his hand. He stood in silence for a moment, scanning the room, then reached for a specific envelope, the first one. "This was written by Henry McCall," he began, his voice steady but unmistakably personal. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for attention. He just wanted someone to listen. He read aloud the last line of the letter again, just as he had weeks ago on live television. "We don't need handouts. We just need a fighting chance to stand again." The crowd hung on every word. "That's what this is all about," he continued. "We forgot something in this country. We forgot the people who built it. The people who plant when it's still dark outside. Who fix tractors with duct tape and prayer. Who raise families on borrowed land and unshakable hope." There was no applause, just silence. A respectful, aching silence. He looked down at the letter once more and then said something he hadn't said at any other stop. "This isn't political. I don't care who you voted for. I care about what we're leaving behind if we don't fix this. I care about the next Henry, the next kid watching their family lose everything." He paused, then added softly, "And I care because this country gave me everything. It's time I give something back." He folded the letter carefully and placed it into his suit pocket. "Not for the cameras," he said. "For me." And just like that, he stepped away from the podium. No campaign banners. No slogans. No handlers whisking him off stage. Just Donald Trump, a former president standing quietly among the people. No longer a headline. No longer a controversy. Just a man honoring a promise. Henry McCall's family was in the crowd that night. His grandson wore a dusty ball cap with hand-stitched letters. Still standing. It didn't go viral. There were no trending hashtags. But somewhere deep in the American heartland, something shifted. And whether you loved him or hated him, one thing was clear. He showed up. And sometimes, that's all a forgotten nation really needs.